But before we do, I have to get some more information on this. A bit of research that was put out today by the University of Sydney, which warns that Australian workers who speak English as a second language suffer from considerable mental strain and are in fact more likely to make poor judgments or ill-informed decisions in the workplace. Staggering research. I'm not really sure what to make of it. Dr. Stefan Volk is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney and has been involved in this. Doctor, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Will. Thanks for having me.
No, I appreciate it. So what's going on here? Why has your research revealed that there are these strains and difficulties in making decisions that are being suffered by people that speak English as a second language?
See, Will, the research that has so far looked at foreign language use has primarily focused on communication issues. So second language speakers, people who learn the language after the age of 5, are limited in their communication abilities. That is what the kind of main stream of research has looked at. We have taken a very different perspective, and we have shown by looking at where in the brain a foreign language is processed, we have shown, and based on previous research, that using a foreign language is mentally demanding. And that is an effect that is pretty much independent of whether you communicate to another person or not. So if you read in a foreign language, if you think in a foreign language, this has a cognitively depleting effect on you.
So hang on, we're talking about people that have learned a second language from the age of 5. So these are people who would speak fluently, for all intents and purposes, be entirely functional in using that language in the workplace or to study with. We're not talking about people that have picked it up at 25 because they're travelling to France for a period of time. These are people that in their everyday lives are using a second language.
Exactly. So there is this critical period of language learning. If you learn 1 or 2 or 3 languages before the age 5, it is processed in the automatic part of the brain. So by using your native language or one of these languages that you learned before age 5, you will not be affected by this cognitively depleting effect. If you learn it after the age of 5, the language will be processed in a different part of the brain, which has a limited information processing capacity. Now, this whole effect is moderated by the level of your language proficiency. So depending on your language proficiency, this effect is stronger or lower. So people who have lived in Australia for 25 years and who learned the language after the age of 5 but have been speaking English perfectly fluently also are not that significantly affected. But those people who, for example, let's look at the job market. Australia has a skilled occupation list for a reason, because we have a scarcity of talent, right? So we are interested in getting talented people from all over the world for certain occupations. We're talking here about high-skilled labor. These people are coming from Europe, maybe India, China. They have had English at school, at university. They can communicate for sure, but they're not at the level of a native speaker. If these people come to Australia and they take up these positions, they will be limited to some extent by the fact that they have to speak in a foreign language, and we want to make people aware of that.
So what for you then is the takeout from this research? Is it that that people should, or employers should, place a greater value on native language speakers? Is it that the teaching of a second language should begin earlier? Because you could go both ways in your interpretation of this, couldn't you?
Yes, well, this is a question I get most of the time. So the people say, okay, that your research implicates that we should discriminate against foreign language speakers and that we should mainly employ native speakers. So first of all, what's important to understand here that this effect that we are pointing out is not an issue for, let's call it, lower skilled blue-collar work, like if you are fixing cars or you're a carpenter. I mean, this still requires skills, but it is not a cognitively highly demanding task in the sense that you have to engage in significant cognitive processing. For those jobs, also because communication is not a major issue in these jobs, this kind of process that we are demonstrating is not an issue at all. So we're talking really about high-skilled people, engineers, doctors, researchers, top graduates from business schools. Those people, for those people, you very often don't have a choice between a native and a non-native. There's scarcity of talent in the world, and you want to attract those people to Australia. We are in a global competition for these people. Once we manage to attract them to Australia, we want to make sure that they can use their their abilities for the task and don't have to kind of waste it on other things. And we are demonstrating, for example, how organizations and employees themselves can make best use of their resources.
Have you considered what the ramifications of this research might be for things like having English as the global language for business, for example? Because it would seem to me that on the basis of what your research is saying, that when those people get around the negotiating table, say native English speakers with someone from another country who is using it for the purpose of that exchange, that those people that for whom it's a second language, having had to devote more of their cognitive ability to just speaking, are actually at a disadvantage in that negotiation, aren't they?
Exactly. This is a very good example, negotiations, right? So you are engaged in multitasking, and that's what we're saying. If you are, so the brain has a limited information processing capacity. It's like, think of you go shopping, you have to remember a shopping list. You can probably remember 8 or 9 items, but as soon as you go to 10 or 12, some of the first items will drop out because simply you have a limited capacity to store information. Some of that capacity is already consumed when you're speaking in a foreign language, leaving less capacity left for other tasks. In a negotiation task, a non-native speaker speaking in English with a native English speaker clearly has a disadvantage because he has to focus on so many things, on his appearance, on his language, on understanding what the other person is saying. So what we would recommend in that situation is that you send not a single non-native negotiator, but a team. Some people just sitting there, observing, trying to listen, trying to process information on the person who actually talks. And then take your time. Don't jump to a conclusion. Don't make quick decisions. But take your time. Be aware that you're limited in your resourcing, in your processing capacities, and give yourself more time to actually think through problems. The native speaker will be less effective because he is not limited by the use of English, right?
What do you think then, as a flow-on from this research, I hear governments at different levels in Australia always talk about, trying to encourage people in Australia to learn a second language. And in schools, they'll often have second languages taught. Certainly private schools have this quite often as well. Sometimes it starts fairly late in people's schooling and development. Based on what you've learnt here, do you think the value of learning a second language by the time you get to school then is diminished? I mean, is it even worth it?
It is absolutely worth it. Learning a foreign language has a stimulating effect on people's brains, right? So who's learning a language before the age 5? Only those kids who grew up in bilingual families, obviously. So most people will learn a language after the age 5. There's clear evidence showing that learning foreign languages has a very, very strong effect on the development of the brains of children, simply because it is stimulating. It is challenging the brain, right? So people who are multilingual have different brain structures. The processing occurs differently. So this has benefits not only for their ability to speak foreign language, but for their general way of processing information. So it is absolutely worth learning a language at any time of your age, because once you achieve a certain proficiency level, the negative effect actually goes down. So what we're saying is, what happened in Europe a lot recently, in particular in continental Europe, France, Germany, Italy, multinational enterprises from one day to another announced that the corporate language from now on is English, and everybody has to communicate in English because we have subsidiaries all over the world, and that facilitates communication. That's certainly true. And then they often said that, okay, we don't have to be expert speakers. It's sufficient if we can somehow communicate and get the message across.
Yes.
That might be true for communication, but it's not true for cognitive processing capacities. So it is important to support people to learn languages, because it is obviously inevitable for firms to switch to English at one point. And English is the lingua franca of the world, right? Yeah. So this is an unstoppable trend, but we got to be prepared for that, and we got to think how we help people who are non-native speakers to deal with these situations.
Fascinating research, Doctor. Appreciate you explaining it to us.
Thanks a lot for having me.
That's Dr. Stefan Volk, who is from the University of Sydney, who was behind this research.